Sometimes history doesn't shout. It hums softly through the sound of an engine. That's exactly what happened on October 30th, 2025, when a white Embraer 190 broke through the morning clouds above Ouagadougou International Airport. There were no fireworks, no grand speeches, just a sea of people, flags fluttering, phones raised high, and a silence so powerful it felt sacred. Then the sound. The wheels touched down, and in that instant, a nation exhaled. This wasn't just a landing. It was a homecoming. For the first time in years, the red and green flag of Burkina Faso gleamed once again on the tail of a plane it truly owned. No leasing, no foreign contracts, no borrowed permission to fly. It was Air Burkina, reborn, a national voice once silenced, now returning to the sky. The elderly waved with trembling hands, children shouted, "It's ours," and somewhere in that crowd, someone whispered the truth that many felt: we made it. It wasn't about luxury or showing off a new aircraft. It was about dignity, about the idea that sovereignty doesn't always arrive in parades. Sometimes it lands quietly on a single runway, carrying the dreams of millions. Under the leadership of President Ibrahim Traoré, this flight became a symbol not of aviation but of revival. Burkina Faso, long labeled landlocked, had proven something deeper. It was never locked by land, it was linked by it. And as the engines cooled and the flag shimmered under the Sahel sun, one question echoed in the air. Could this single flight mark the rebirth of African sovereignty, one runway at a time? If you've ever believed that nations can rise without asking for permission, if you've ever felt that Africa deserves to own its wings, then stay with us, because this is not just a story about a plane, it's the story of a people learning to fly again. Please share if you believe Africa has the right to soar on its own wings. Subscribe if you know that the truth, not the headlines, defines history. The morning of October 30th, 2025 will forever remain etched in Burkina Faso's memory. The skies above Ouagadougou International Airport shimmered in golden light, as if the Sahel itself was holding its breath. From the main terminal to the dirt roads outside the fence, people gathered: families, soldiers, students, market women, all waiting for the same thing: the moment their nation would finally take flight again. And then a silver line appeared on the horizon. Slowly, it grew larger until its wings caught the sun. The Embraer 190 descended gracefully, its engines humming like a heartbeat returning after years of silence. When its wheels kissed the runway, the cheers erupted like thunder. Flags waved, cameras flashed, and even the most stoic faces broke into tears. For a people long told they could not stand on their own, this landing was not just about an aircraft, it was about a nation's soul taking back the sky. For years, Air Burkina had been a ghost of its former self. Once a proud emblem of national progress, founded in 1967, it had slowly crumbled under bureaucracy, corruption, and dependency. By 2023, the airline had collapsed entirely, flights grounded, salaries unpaid, its hangars silent and empty. The media called it the silent collapse. But to the people, it felt like losing a part of themselves. Because when a country's flag no longer flies in the air, it's not just business that dies, it's identity. Then came President Ibrahim Traoré, young, determined, and unwilling to inherit excuses. Where others saw failure, he saw unfinished work. He understood that reviving an airline wasn't just an economic move, it was a moral restoration, a psychological revival of confidence. His message was simple: if we can fly again, we can rebuild anything. He appointed Traoré as CEO in March 2024, a man known for solving problems, not giving speeches. Zacaria's first words to the press captured the entire mission. We don't need to impress the world. We just need to serve our people and serve them well. It was a radical shift. No more trying to compete with giants like Air France or Emirates. No more chasing prestige or validation. Air Burkina would focus on what truly mattered: regional routes, reliable service, and national trust. With government backing, a full-scale restructuring began. Maintenance centers were revived, training programs launched for local engineers and pilots, and new partnerships built directly with manufacturers, not through European intermediaries. Every reform spoke the same quiet truth: Burkina Faso will no longer rent its future. And then came the centerpiece of this rebirth, the Embraer 190. Sleek, efficient, and built for Africa's terrain, it wasn't chosen to show off, it was chosen to work. With space for 98 passengers and short runway capability, the aircraft was perfect for the country's geography and its ambition. More importantly, it was owned outright, not leased. That fact alone made the crowd that day cheer louder. It meant the skies were finally truly theirs. Inside the cabin reflected the nation's spirit, simple, elegant, and proud. Leather seats, soft, LED lighting, calm interiors. Not luxury, but dignity. The kind of environment where a Burkina Faso traveler could sit back and think, this feels like us. From that moment on, the air in Ouagadougou felt different. Not because of noise, but because of meaning. When the engines shut down and the doors opened, people weren't just watching passengers disembark, they were witnessing history walk back home. For the first time in years, the flag of Burkina Faso flew on an aircraft that didn't belong to anyone else. For the first time in years, the skies above the Sahel echoed not with borrowed voices, but with their own. And as the Embraer 190 taxied past the crowd, sunlight reflecting off its tail, you could feel a nation's confidence lifting once again. Burkina Faso was no longer waiting for permission to fly. It had bought its wings and earned its pride. There are moments in a nation's story that move quietly but strike deep. The landing of Air Burkina's Embraer 190 was one of them, a calm revolution disguised as a routine flight. But as the applause faded and the engines cooled, something larger began to unfold. This wasn't just about Burkina Faso getting its airline back. It was about Africa rewriting the flight map drawn by colonial hands. For decades, air routes across Africa were designed to serve Europe's convenience, not Africa's connection. To fly from Ouagadougou to Dakar, travelers were forced to pass through Paris. To reach Lagos from Bamako, they stopped in Brussels. It wasn't geography, it was control, a system built to remind Africans that even in the sky they needed permission. That's what made this moment different. When Air Burkina's Embraer 190 took off again, it didn't just lift passengers, it lifted an entire philosophy. Under President Ibrahim Traoré's leadership and with Zakaria Traoré's precision, the airline's mission was rewritten: reconnect Africa to itself first. Routes long abandoned were restored: Ouagadougou to Bamako, Niamey, Lomé, Abidjan, Cotonou. Flights once routed through Paris now flew straight across the Sahel, linking neighbors long divided by artificial borders. Each route became a line of healing, a bridge between people who shared history but were separated by colonial logistics. And when that first regional flight departed Ouagadougou to Bamako, the scene was pure emotion. Crowds gathered again, waving flags as the aircraft accelerated down the runway. But this time the cheers weren't just for a plane. They were for what it meant: Africa no longer circling Europe to reach itself. Africa isn't closing its skies, one commentator said. It's reclaiming them. Those words echoed far beyond Burkina Faso. In Mali, Niger, and Ghana, young engineers and aviation students watched with pride, inspired by what was happening next door. It wasn't a miracle, it was a blueprint. And quietly, international observers began to take notice. Western aviation media reacted cautiously, some with admiration, others with unease. Articles began to appear questioning the airline's safety standards or whether regional markets could sustain profitability. But beneath those polite headlines was a familiar anxiety, a fear that Africa's independence might finally become practical. Inside Burkina Faso, the response was electric. For the first time in decades, people began posting photos of their boarding passes on social media with the words "Proud to fly Burkina Faso." Airports filled with music and laughter as staff greeted travelers in native languages. It was small, simple, and yet monumental proof that national pride didn't need to come from speeches. It could come from service done right. This quiet success also stirred something deeper, a collective realization that sovereignty isn't abstract. It's visible. It's something you can touch board and take home to your family. Each takeoff was an act of defiance, each landing a reaffirmation of dignity. And that was the true climax, not the roar of engines, but the silence that followed. The silence of people finally feeling free to believe again. No longer waiting for Western investors to dictate their routes, no longer renting their ambitions from others. Under the sunlight of the Sahel, the Embraer's red and green tail gleamed as it disappeared into the horizon. Elders in the crowd murmured blessings, children pointed upward, their faces lit with wonder. "We used to look up and see foreign flags," one father said quietly. "Now my son sees his own." That is how revolutions begin, not with guns, not with marches, but with symbols that restore belief. Air Burkina wasn't just an airline anymore, it was a declaration that Africa would no longer be grounded by doubt. And as its flight path stretched from Ouagadougou to Lomé, from Niamey to Abidjan, one truth became clear: Burkina Faso hadn't just revived an airline, it had reignited a continent's courage to fly on its own wings. When the excitement of that historic landing began to settle, what followed across Burkina Faso was something no economist could have measured: a quiet rebirth of confidence. People began to talk differently, dream differently, move differently. It wasn't just about air travel, it was about a nation rediscovering its rhythm. Before Air Burkina's revival, many citizens had grown used to disappointment. The words national project often meant corruption or failure. But now something tangible had changed. For the first time in years, a government promise had landed literally in front of their eyes. You could see it in the way market women spoke about the president, in the way young mechanics signed up for training at the new Aviation Maintenance Academy. The message was simple but profound. If we can fly again, then we can rebuild anything. The economic ripple came next. By the end of 2025, over 200 new jobs had been created, from aircraft engineers and ground staff to ticketing agents and catering teams. Hotels near the airport reported a surge in local bookings. Small suppliers, food vendors, maintenance parts producers, logistics firms all began to flourish again. Even in rural towns hundreds of miles away, farmers proudly said they were part of the nation's progress because, in their words, our mangoes can fly again. But the deeper transformation was psychological. The people no longer saw the flag as just a symbol, they saw it moving, flying, connecting. The sense of belonging that had faded during years of hardship started to return. A teacher in Ouagadougou described it best: when my students look up now, they see possibility. They see a future that carries our name. Politically, the revival of Air Burkina reshaped the narrative around President Ibrahim Traoré. Critics had once accused him of being too radical, too young, too idealistic, but his decision to prioritize sovereignty over dependency had paid off. He had proven that leadership wasn't about loud declarations, it was about deliverables. He reminded the world that political legitimacy in Africa can come not just from elections, but from restoration, from giving people back something they thought they had lost forever: pride. Inside the cabinet, the success of Air Burkina triggered a shift in mindset. Ministries that had relied on foreign consultants began to develop local task forces. The phrase self-reliance before partnership became an unofficial motto of the administration. Other sectors, from agriculture to education, began to model their reforms after the airline's story: start small, act local, own it fully. Beyond Burkina Faso, the effect spread through the Sahel. In Mali and Niger, where similar movements for independence from Western influence were growing, Air Burkina became a case study. Aviation schools across West Africa started adding a new topic to their curriculum: national sovereignty in aviation management. Of course, not everyone celebrated. Some opposition voices warned that pride could blind progress, that the government risked politicizing aviation. But even those criticisms couldn't erase what people felt in their hearts: that something sacred had been restored. Because when a nation reclaims control over its own sky, it reclaims more than airspace. It reclaims the right to decide its direction, to move, to trade, to dream without permission. And that, perhaps, is the most powerful political act of all, turning transportation into transformation and proving that true governance begins when the people can see themselves not just on the ground, but in the sky. Across the Atlantic, the images from Ouagadougou stirred a quiet curiosity. On American television, few networks covered it, just a passing mention: a 30-second clip of a small African nation celebrating a new aircraft. But among scholars, aviation analysts, and members of the African diaspora, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. In a world accustomed to seeing Africa through the lens of crisis, the sight of a Burkinabe-owned jet touching down on Burkinabe soil felt revolutionary. It wasn't about commerce, it was about control, the kind of control every superpower once fought to claim. For many older Americans who still remember the golden age of Pan Am and TBA, it brought back a truth often forgotten: sovereignty begins in motion. Nations that own their skies control their future. Across Washington, think tank discussions began quietly comparing the Traore model to post-colonial aviation in Asia and Latin America. Some analysts admitted that this was something rare: a low-budget, locally managed airline succeeding where international lenders had failed. Others, less generous, called it symbolic populism. But even they could not deny that symbolism moves people more powerfully than spreadsheets ever could. In the United States, members of the African diaspora reacted first and loudest. On social media, Black American commentators praised the moment as a new kind of independence. A viral post read, "When a Burkina Faso pilot takes off in a Burkina Faso-owned jet, he's not just flying a plane, he's flying history for every one of us who still carries Africa in our blood." From Harlem cafes to Atlanta, radio shows conversations shifted from nostalgia to admiration. Older voices, men and women who had marched in civil rights rallies decades ago, spoke of Ibrahim Traoré as part of a new generation of leaders, proving that Pan-Africanism was not a dream, but a daily practice. He reminds us of Sankara, one radio host said, "Only this time, the revolution comes with an airplane, not a gun." In Europe, the tone was different. Aviation executives worried quietly about the precedent. If more African nations followed Burkina Faso's example, buying rather than leasing aircraft, building domestic maintenance hubs, training their own crews, European carriers could lose their most profitable routes. Some media outlets dressed their concern as safety or efficiency debates, but the subtext was clear: the monopoly on African skies was beginning to break. Meanwhile, in Asia and Latin America, governments sympathetic to the South-South movement took notice. Brazil's aerospace community applauded the purchase of the Embraer 190, calling it a symbol of cooperation between equals. Indian commentators drew parallels to Air India's early years of independence. Even China's state press quietly praised Burkina Faso for choosing practical sovereignty over symbolic alliances. Back in the United States, the deeper question lingered: what if this modest success, one aircraft, one flag, one runway, carries lessons for America itself? For a nation that once believed in building and owning its own infrastructure, Air Burkina's rebirth whispered a reminder that dignity is not inherited. It is built, flown, and maintained every single day. And for Americans watching from afar, especially those whose ancestors were once carried away from these same coasts, the image of that plane gliding over the Sahel meant something profoundly personal. It said Africa is not a charity case. Africa is coming back steady, proud, and airborne. As dusk falls over Ouagadougou, the golden light of the Sahel fades into the deep red of twilight. From the runway, you can still hear the distant hum of engines. That soft vibration that once meant dependency now sounds like freedom reborn. The Embraer 190 cuts through the clouds, its tail painted in red and green glimmering in the last sunlight. And as it disappears beyond the horizon, you can almost feel what the people below are whispering: "We're flying again." But this story, the rebirth of Air Burkina, is not only about one nation. It is about a continent quietly rewriting its destiny one runway at a time. Because sovereignty isn't only about borders or ballots. It's about the power to move, to decide, to connect without permission. For decades, Africa was told it could not sustain its own airlines, its own industries, its own future. The world said, "You're not ready." But that day, as the Embraer's wheels lifted off Sahel soil, the world saw something it wasn't prepared to witness: Africa refusing to ask for approval. Still, history warns us that success breeds interference. The same powers that once drew lines on Africa's land now draw invisible routes across its skies. Control doesn't always come through armies anymore. Sometimes it comes through contracts, loans, and partnerships that sound generous, but chain the wings of a nation. So the real test begins now. Can Burkina Faso protect what it has rebuilt? Can Africa hold its course when the winds of global pressure grow stronger? And can the rest of the world, especially those watching from America, finally see this, not as a miracle, but as a model? Because the truth is, what happened in Burkina Faso is more than aviation. It's a reminder to every nation, every community, that dignity doesn't require permission. It only requires courage, the courage to rise, rebuild, and believe again. As the world watches, one thing is certain: Africa is no longer waiting for takeoff clearance. It's already in the air. So tonight, when you look up and see a plane slicing across the night sky, remember this: that sound you hear is not just an engine, it's sovereignty in motion. Do you believe Africa is finally ready to control its own skies? Share your thoughts below. If you believe that President Ibrahim Traoré's leadership represents the beginning of a new chapter for African independence, not through words but through action, then please share this story. Subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines. And share if you believe that Africa has every right to fly, to lead, and to dream again.